Hello. So this video is a performance review of William Shakespeare's Richard III at the Globe Theatre in London, directed by L. Wilde. I'm joined by Andi Stout, and we're gonna talk about it. Hi. So what do you want to start by talking about with this one?
Richard III's codpiece.
Okay. Go for it.
So what I found most interesting was Richard III's codpiece. Throughout the play, as his power grew, so does his codpiece.
Mm-hmm.
So it starts out relatively normal. I mean, a codpiece generally commands your attention. But this is a pretty standard one. It's just basic black, no adornments when we first get there, and he's sort of in a state of not quite becoming powerful, but being recognized.
Yeah.
And then as the king gets sicker and Richard, it's clear that he's vying for power, there are evolutions of the codpiece. So it gets slightly larger, still not adorned, but we as the audience start to wonder, is that growing? Is that changing?
Yeah,
and
it's not clear immediately. Yeah.
And then the next iteration that it has, so this is the third iteration, I believe. There's this green string on it, which also calls attention to us. So there's a little bit of adornment there. And it reminded me of, in the late 80s, early 90s, as part of the gay underground club scene, Calvin Klein designed these jeans that had a little tag, like right by the crotchal region, that when you were under fluorescent lights, it would just glow, calling your attention to it. So it's not totally in your face, but it's getting there.
Yeah.
And I think when later on in the play, when we can see the Calvin Klein underwear line on Richard III's costume, it might play an allusion to that. So I'm not sure if that was intentional or if that was meant to signal that, but to me, that's what it did. And then later on, as there's conflict with the certainty of Richard III's power, then the codpiece becomes spiked.
Yes.
And so this might represent the sort of turmoil that the security of his power might hold. And then later on, when he is crowned king, it is fully on the jewel.
Yeah.
So that is a new meaning to crown jewels, I suppose.
Yep.
And then later on, when the power starts to recede, or we again see the moment of conflict, the spiky codpiece comes through. And when he's even trying to negotiate with, I think it's Queen Anne, where he's talking about after the princess...
to marry Queen Elizabeth.
Queen Elizabeth. So after the princes have been murdered, he wants to bestow in Elizabeth's belly...
So there's Queen Elizabeth, and then there's her daughter Elizabeth. Richard wants to marry. Elizabeth is the widow. Queen Elizabeth is the widow of Edward, Richard's brother, who was the king, who's now dead. She was also the mother of the Tower Princes, Edward and Richard. It's confusing. There's about 8 names in the whole play. 4 for men, 4 for women. So the Tower Princes, the older of the 2 princes would become king, but Richard has them declared illegitimate and then kills them. And then Richard becomes king, and he wants to marry Queen Elizabeth's daughter, so that he can secure his own power.
And when he's having that conversation, he is wearing the actor is wearing the spiky codpiece. Yeah. And then there's a lot of thrusting from behind when that conversation is going on, and she's conflicted about whether or not this is going to happen or should happen. But women don't have a lot of recourse or rights. So this is really the only means of survival at this point.
Yeah.
And when this conversation is happening, Richard is standing behind Queen Elizabeth quite a bit, and there's a significant amount of thrusting,
Yeah.
which might symbolize the intersection between sex and violence.
Mm-hmm. So that, I mean, I definitely think that's an element here. This was a very, not sexually explicit necessarily, but there's a lot of implicit sexuality in this performance. Like, the relationship between Richard and Buckingham seemed much more like a romantic relationship than I get from the text itself. Like,
and there's a kind of betrayal too, because he was promised a dukedom that he never got.
Yes, Buckingham is promised, I think it's the dukedom of Herefordshire or something like that, and never gets it from Richard. And that is potentially the reason that Buckingham doesn't betray Richard, but when Richard is like, I want the Tower Princes dead, Buckingham's like, maybe just give me a sec to think about it. And Richard takes that as a betrayal. But the other sort of element that's interesting with the codpiece is the sort of gender and, well, primarily gender element of the play, because this is a production where all members of the cast were either female or non-binary. But most of the characters are men. So we have that element. And so the codpiece is a kind of prosthetic penis, of course, but it's also not a prosthetic penis in the sense that it isn't sort of meant to be a false penis. It's meant to be an ornament. But in the early modern period, of course, codpieces were worn by people who otherwise had penises. Women did not wear them. They were not a standard component of women's attire. And so when Michelle Terry, who plays Richard in this production, is costumed in a codpiece, there is an element of drag there, right? Like, sure, when we first meet her, she's in a sort of leather doublet, jeans, black boots. That's fine. Like, today, black jeans, especially tight black jeans, is not a distinctly manly style, although at one point jeans were exclusively male. And today they're not. But the codpiece has never been an element of female fashion. And so you got that sort of element. But the thing that I think gets more interesting is later on in the production, we have two costumes for Richard that are sort of open-chested, right? One is this sort of, I think, blue and gold robe, if I remember correctly. And the other is this green feathered doublet.
Very peacocky.
Very peacocky. And it's just open chest. Michelle Terry, female actor. So they put her in a prosthetic chest piece, which presumably is more male-looking than Terry's actual chest. I don't know for sure. I am making that assumption. If I'm wrong, correct me in the comments. But this was a chest piece that was specifically designed. And there's a couple of things that are interesting about it to me. The first one is that I think, and I say this because we were actually seated in the Globe. We were a good ways away. I think that it was designed to sort of reflect Richard's what his actual body probably looked like, because Richard had scoliosis. And so that's a sort of curvature of the spine. And I think his spine curved this direction toward the left-hand side of his body. And it looked to me from where I was sitting like this sort of portion of the abdominal and the pectoral region was somewhat sunk in, which I think you get sometimes with people with scoliosis. So I think they had actually sort of designed it with Richard's historical body in mind. But I think there's another important element to this, which is that this is a female-presenting actor with these sort of masculine prosthetic masculine elements added to her body. It's not playing a male character. It's not
villain specifically.
Well, yes, but it's not that much of a stretch, I think, to sort of read that as a trans representation, right? Not a trans character necessarily, but that the physical body of Richard is played by a female presenting actor using male prosthetics to get the appearance of a male body, I think is not that hard to read that as trans. And then Richard, of course, yes, is the tyrant, is the villain, the person for whom it's a good thing when they are toppled at the end. And the person playing Richmond, who does the toppling of Richard, is Sam Quirart. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right. If not, I apologize. Quirart is masculine presenting. They use both male and gender neutral pronouns, as far as I can tell. So I think they are non-binary. But they were the only actor who most people would probably default to gendering male. So Clara played Catesby, which is fine, whatever it is. One of Richard's last henchmen, doesn't really matter, hench people, whatever it is. Totally fine, I don't have an issue with that. But the fact that Clara plays Richmond, so we have a male presenting actor, even if that actor is non-binary, who defeats the villain, who is a female presenting actor with prosthetic male elements to appear more masculine. And to be clear, I don't think the production team, the director, the cast, whatever it is, was going for this reading, but I think it's not unreasonable to see in that a sort of triumph of the male, real man over the trans imposter. And the fact that it's an all-female and non-binary cast makes me think that they did not intend for that. That the good thing when Richmond wins at the end was not, the villainous trans is toppled. I don't think that's what they were going for, but it's also such an odd production choice to put really the one member of the cast who most presents as male as Richmond. I don't know what to make of it.
I don't either, but it's something that struck me that sort of complicates what could be a really inclusive production.
Yeah. And I think it still is an inclusive production. Just that seems very odd. And of course, the other thing, this actually is not the big debate with this particular production. The big debate based on what's sort of going on in the press and what people have been talking about regarding this show is that Terry is not a disabled actor. So there's been a lot of pushback from people who want Richard III one of perhaps the most famous character with disabilities in theater history, maybe apart from Oedipus. There are a lot of people who want Richard played by an actor with disabilities, which helps ensure that actors with disabilities get opportunities to work, where they raise their professional profile by playing major roles. And of course, the Globe is a big enough and influential enough theater that they can easily hire an actor with a disability. Like, they can find somebody who's going to be amazing in that role. And so there's been a lot of critiques of that. What's your stance on this? I'm putting you on the spot.
I thought Terry was absolutely brilliant in the role.
Sure.
And maybe someone else would have been too, but now when I think of Richard III, I now think of Terry.
You slightly dodged the actual question there. And I don't fault you for that necessarily. But
I'm not the one making the decisions. It did seem like there was at least one actor that had a disability, I think hearing impaired possibly, but I don't know that anyone else in the cast fit that bill either.
Yeah. Katie Eric, playing Lady Anne, signed at least portions of her speeches. We sort of haven't done any homework on this. We haven't looked up Katie Eric to find out whether she actually is hearing impaired or whether that was something that was sort of added in for one reason or another. But yeah. So, I mean, but then that sort of raises the question of like, all right, if you have one actor with a disability in the cast and it's not Richard, is that better or worse? Is that sort of I don't know. I feel like you could read that as sort of, it's an insult to actors with disabilities who might otherwise have wanted to play Richard, that they are not being cast for it, whereas Lady Anne, who is not a character in the play with a disability, gets cast for it. I don't know. I mean, again, there's a lot of arguments on both sides with disability theater studies about whether or not actors with disabilities should specifically be cast for characters with disabilities, whether actors without disabilities can/should play characters with disabilities, and if you say characters with disabilities must be played by or should be played by actors with disabilities, do you then run the risk of it translating as only cast actors with disabilities in roles for characters with disabilities? Like, do you sort of marginalize actors with disabilities into this fairly small number of roles? I don't know.
I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I don't know what the casting lineup looked like.
Yeah. And again, that's a big issue with smaller theater companies. If you're the Globe, you can pick up the phone and call whoever you want and say, we want you to play Richard, and they'll say, yeah, okay, great. But, yeah, I think it's a difficult thing to parse whether or not it's a good thing to sort of try and align the physical body of the actor with the physical body of the character, because it opens up a number of potentially problematic lines of exclusion.
And I feel like going in as a director, you kind of know you're going to take heat one way or another, whatever decision you make for something like that.
Yeah. I guess it just depends on which side of the political spectrum you're more interested in being critiqued by.